Asia Institute. I'm a part-time student, and my research focuses on constitutional pacifism. And I'm also a lawyer, government lawyer is my background. So my interest is in the Unconstitutional Security Legislation Litigation Association, which is what I'm going to talk to you about, and it's the focus of my fieldwork. I'm just going to begin by introducing the association, just very briefly touch on Japan's constitutional pacifism, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of local chapters of this association and their impacts on the wider debate on the issue of constitutional pacifism. So, to begin with, this is the national, you can see in the slide here, this is the national representatives of the association. And that picture is from when they announced that they were forming this association back in 2015. So, next slide. Okay, so the association was founded in September 2015 to challenge the constitutionality of the Abe government's peace and security legislation. And it is a network of 1,600 lawyers, 8,000 plaintiffs, and they are pursuing lawsuits in 25 courts around Japan. So that was, at the time, a number of those cases have now come to an end, but there's still a number ongoing because in Japan litigation takes a very, very long time to progress, and I'm following a couple of those. So if we just go back a step, Japan's constitutional pacifism is found in the preamble to the Constitution and in Article 9. So that underlined part there is quite important, as we'll see a bit later in the presentation, and simply says that we recognise that all peoples of the world have the right to live in peace, free from fear and loss. Now, a preamble to a constitution is often something that's not considered enforceable, but in this case, which I'll explain a bit later, it's quite important. The key article, however, of the Constitution is Article 9, and it has two paragraphs, as you can see there, and if we boil it right down, it has really two operative parts. So the first paragraph is a renunciation of law, and the use of force to settle international disputes. And the second part of the second paragraph is a ban on land, sea and air forces, as well as all other war potential. The key for constitutional pacifism though in Japan is how that is interpreted. A point to note about that is that we're talking about the interpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution as it is written in Japanese, not as it's written in English. However, the basis of Japan's constitution is a draft constitution which was produced by the United States occupation in 1946. So there are official versions in English and Japanese, but when you interpret the Japanese constitution, naturally you interpret it according to the Japanese version, and there are a few nuances of difference, which I'm not going to cover today. But what I will talk about is whether Article 9 imposes an absolute or a qualified pacifism. So if we go back a step, on its face, it seems quite clear that it imposes an absolute pacifism. So Japan is not allowed to engage in war, it's not allowed to maintain land, sea and air forces. So that seems fairly clear. However, it has not been interpreted in that way, and it has been interpreted according to what I would call qualified pacifism. So under international law, states are permitted to defend themselves, so it's a permitted use of force. And what the Japanese government has said is that Article 9 is a renunciation of war meaning aggressive war, not wars of self-defence, which are clearly under international law. And then the second part, which talks about land, sea, and air forces, means land, sea, and air forces that enable you to engage in aggressive war. So therefore, a self-defence force, which is what the Japanese military is called, is permissible. And there are a number of norms that are built up around this qualified pacifism. The key one being that Japan's allowed to take military preparations that are the minimum necessary to ensure the defence of Japan. So Japan can't acquire nuclear weapons or things like that which could be used for aggressive warfare, but it can acquire defensive weapon systems. And that was endorsed in a very famous case called Sunagawa, which I've just got down there. And essentially the Japanese Supreme Court, for the one time in its existence, interpreted Article 9 to say, yes, qualified pacifism is the way that the Constitution should be interpreted. And that has been the position all the way along until recently. So one of the key norms that existed was that Japan could not participate in collective self-defence. So that is, it could not come to the military aid of other countries that were under attack. And the simple reason for that was that Japan is permitted to defend itself under its constitution, but anything else would be in excess of what Article 9 prohibits. Recently, in the post-Cold War era, there has been a move towards a lot more collective security activity, and Shinzo Abe was an advocate of Japan modernising itself and sort of joining that movement. And when he became Prime Minister, he reformed a number of Japan's defence policies along those lines. Most controversial was the 2014 reinterpretation of the Constitution, which in simple terms means that the Japanese government said that Article 9 doesn't mean what it used to mean, it means something slightly different. And part of that was to recognise collective self-defence. However, it was recognised in a sort of ambiguous way and a limited way. So that sort of needed to be put into legislation in order to enact that, which led to these 2015 peace and security bills. And they were two bills. The first bill amended a number of laws to enable Japan to deploy its forces overseas as part of peace operations. And the second one was to allow it to respond seamlessly to international developments. And there were a number of policies that sat behind that which sort of expanded on what it meant. But I think the key point for our purposes today is that recognising collective self-defence was a big deal. It was overturning something that had stood for almost 60 years as a prohibition. And so then that triggered a number of protests, street protests in Japan. And these were the first protests that have been seen for many, many years. One of the key points that I'd like to note is that those protests were youth-led. There was a famous group called SEALs who were at the forefront of this. And that's an interesting point to note because later when I talk about the people who participate in litigation, they tend to be of the older generation. Okay, so I'll transition now to law and social change and just make a couple of quick comments about the way law has been used to affect social change in Japan and how it's been treated in some of the literature. So the starting point is that the Constitution contains a number of human rights, but those human rights, although they look very impressive in their written form, they tend not to be interpreted in an expansive way. They tend to be quite narrow and conservatively interpreted. So the Japanese courts will qualify human rights against things like the public welfare and the interests of the Japanese people broadly. And the courts are also very reluctant to make rulings against the government. So there's only about a dozen laws that have ever been found unconstitutional. And even when the courts do make rulings that favour, litigants against the government, they tend to be difficult to enforce as well. So the courts lack the ability to enforce outcomes. So that's sort of some general overview. A couple of interesting parts out of this literature. So Upham has talked about how the courts like to bring about a remedy where bureaucrats can craft an administrative way of solving the problem. So they'll give some direction that is then picked up and then crafted into an administrative outcome. And then Steinhoff collected together some different research looking at social movement groups who used litigation, and there are a number of interesting practices and ways that those groups use them. So beyond simply trying to win a case in court, things like trying to win public support, attract attention to issues, it's not just a win in court or don't win at all approach. And then the last one there is Hatano, and she studied a Korean school that was subject to hate speech, and they were actually successful in human rights litigation, which is quite unusual. And one of the key things that she identified is that they were able to universalise the idea of hate speech. So essentially, racial discrimination doesn't just apply to us as like a narrow part of Japanese society, but hate speech, racial discrimination is universal and applies to everybody, all the Japanese people. Okay, so I'll turn back to the US LLA, and I guess just to talk a little bit about their organisation. So they're based in Tokyo, but it's more of a network of lawyers, because the 25 other lawsuits run in the different courts across Japan, so everywhere from Okinawa all the way up to Hokkaido have their own local litigation happening. But what the Tokyo-based office does is provide the sort of the national representation, draws together what happens in the proceedings in different courts. And so they run a website, they have social media outreach, they print brochures and newsletters, and also try to attract publicity through. They've printed some books, they have given interviews in local media and national media. Okay, so the analysis of how law litigation can be used by social groups to affect change tends to be quite an unlimited literature. So Alberston here in 2011, she put together an interesting way of organising that understanding and approach to it. And I apologise, it's a bit small, I think, to see. But one of the key parts of that was some work that she built on from Jane. And essentially it was to split up effects, internal and external. So internal effects means what impact does litigation have on the people who are undertaking that litigation. So, you know, formation of a collective identity, attracting resources, those sort of internal effects, or external effects, so what effects it has on those outside of the group. So does it attract publicity? Does it help to provide legitimacy? And then there's the negative effects too. So the negative internal effects may be that it drains resources. So people's time and money is put on litigation when there may be more effective measures of pursuing their cause. An external effect may be to generate opposition, so from counter movements or from the government. Okay, so the US LOA's two claims, which occur in all of the different courts, but the lawyers run them different ways, is an injunction against the deployment of the self-defence forces overseas, which essentially says that you can't deploy the self-defence force overseas because that's a breach of Article 9, that's unconstitutional. The second claim is, I think, more interesting. It's a claim that by passing the 2015 legislation, there was an infringement on the rights of plaintiffs to live in peace. So there is no right to live in peace in the Constitution. But, as I mentioned right at the start, the preamble says that all people have the right to live in peace and free of war. And the argument essentially runs that because of that line in the preamble, Article 9's Constitution and another article which allows people to sue the government, you can construct this right to live in peace. Now, that right to live in peace has not been recognised by the Japanese Supreme Court, but it has been recognised by a lower court in the case of Imamura, which I've noted there. It would be a new implied constitutional right. It would be quite a radical thing for the courts to recognise that, so I think the prospects are low, but there are important reasons why that's claimed. And the main one is it allows grounds for ordinary people to challenge the government, because otherwise there's no way to show that they've suffered damage or they're being affected by Article 9 and constitutional pacifism being breached. Okay, so just to quickly talk about my field work. So I followed litigation in Osaka and in Fukuoka. The Osaka litigation has come to an end. A couple of observations. The plaintiffs had the opportunity to give witness testimony and talk about how they were impacted by the legislation, and spoke about how it gave them fear that Japan was going to go to war. The plaintiffs were also largely older Japanese. Many of them were baby boomer generation or even older, and talked about their sort of fear of what this was all leading to because of their family's experience and some of their personal experiences of war. So their lawsuit was rejected in district court, and then it was rejected on appeal by the High Court, and they did not appeal any further because they took it to the Supreme Court that the other litigation around the country would not be able to proceed. Okay, so in Fukuoka there are 148 plaintiff members, and I'd say 40 to 50 of them regularly attend. I regularly attend, so I know. And again, they give very interesting witness testimony talking about how they're concerned about what is going to happen because of this law. They're worried about the path, the slippery slope. And the Fukuoka litigation has been rejected at first instance in April this year, and they have now appealed. So next February there'll be a further hearing in the High Court of Fukuoka. So just to quickly talk about some of the impacts that I've observed using the Alston model, and given there's not a lot of time, I'll just focus on a couple of the more interesting ones. I think that the internal positive effects of this litigation is that it has allowed resources to be used in an effective way. So constitutional lawyers in Japan tend to be opposed to the legislation. They naturally have legal skills, so getting them to undertake litigation is an excellent use of their skills and time. And the plaintiffs, as I said, tend to be older Japanese and are often retired, so they have the time to participate in litigation. and I don't think it diverts them from other activities. So that would be an observation there. One of the negative effects that's talked about by Alston is that there's the potential to demobilise. So if you get a defeat in court, that means that the plaintiffs, the people who are trying to progress an issue, will give up and they won't pursue the issue anymore. But I think from my observations, the people who have joined the litigation have already had a background in Article 9 activism, and while the Osaka plaintiffs were defeated, I know a number of them continue with their activism in other forms, so they're already members of different Article 9 groups promoting constitutional pacifism. Probably the last one that I'd like to briefly comment on is publicity. So publicity is positive in the sense that it has continued, this litigation has continued to get some publicity for the cause of 2015's legislation being unconstitutional. As I said, the National Secretariat has done some social media outreach, there are books, they've given some interviews to some smaller magazines, but I'd say it's not an issue on the national agenda. At the regional level, the court cases are covered at the decision point, so the news media came to observe the decisions both in Osaka and Fukuoka. So it's a little bit of publicity, but I'd say it has had a limited impact. So while it may get a few stories in the newspaper, there's no signs of activity, outrage, anything being generated at the moment. Alright, so I'll just quickly finish by talking about the prospects. I'd say that it's unlikely that they will achieve a victory in court, certainly not at the Superior Court level. It is possible that a lower court could rule in their favour. There have been decisions in the past in favour of pacifist groups, and that has been effective in generating publicity and public debate, so that's a reason why they continue on. But it's highly unlikely the Supreme Court is going to support their views. However, I think it's important to note that the US LMA is aware that this is only part of a broader political campaign. So ultimately, litigation can help push their cause along, but it's not going to be the way that this issue is ultimately resolved. It's going to take, I guess, a change in political sentiment. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, any questions, comments?
Thank you, Adam. I know that you've mentioned that you've been following the work of USLA under Abbey's, so it's a bit of a tongue twister, Abbey's government. Have you observed any change in their work as a result of this death? And if so, in what way? If not, why do you think that might be the case?
I haven't observed any changes in their activities based on Abe's death. It hasn't affected the legal situation, I suppose, and it didn't seem to generate a lot of interest in constitutional pacifism, unfortunately. So, being on the ground in Japan, people talked more about the whole background to Abe's death and the disturbed man who killed him than anything like that. And as for the US LLA, it was kind of like business as usual, and lawyers are focused on what they're doing, and the plaintiffs are still motivated by their case.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One, I have to question your sort of conclusion that the court decisions do not have a mechanism for enforcement. Actually, I think even Frank Upham would disagree with that as well. One of the mechanisms that they do actually have for enforcement is that one decision being made at court, if it's not followed, or if there's no changes in the law or the Constitution, I mean the Constitution will not change, that will not happen, but if there's no changes, actually all the lawyers can actually, the group can actually make another claim, and the result will be the same. So if you keep repeating, then the government may actually force a change of policy. In this given case, constantly. And in fact, Upham actually, I think you quote his book was in the 80s. Since then, he published many more cases on how this actually happened. So that's one thing I think I have a question about. The second one I have is, I wonder because many of the cases we have used here, usually the cases that took place maybe before 2017, and there's also a lot of changes in terms of the reinvitation of Article 9, and all many of the activities that actually happened since 2017 in terms of Japanese involvement overseas, in terms of military and joint exercises, which is just looking at the internet, and just I see that last month, actually 2 or 3 weeks ago, the DHI and US joint military exercises, right? And that is actually a sort of forward to detain or to address the China and North Korea issue. So you can see that one example of this reputation of Article 9 already to be much more. It's not like as effective as before. And second, it's also now Japan is one of the leading arms exporter in the world as well. So that's actually another reputation of Article 9 as well. So I just wondered if you can comment on those particular victims like this new government in 1970.
Sure. If I don't recall everything you say, jump in and let me know. I suppose the reason why I made the comment that the courts lack remedies is that I guess the prime example is the elections cases, and the courts have frequently commented that there are states of unconstitutionality that need to be addressed, but it just drags on and on and on. And I think your point, though, that while there's an unconstitutionality or potential unconstitutionality, it allows more cases to happen. And I think that's one of the advantages of the right to live in peace being used in this circumstance that I talked about, because it allows people to make the case. But on the second point, if I understand, are you talking about other changes to, like Article 9, other things that the Abe government sort of reforms, and how they also created potential unconstitutionalities? Is that the point you wanted me to address?
The point I want to address is the extension of the interpretation of Article 9 that actually allows Japan to be more sort of aggressive. Before 1990, right? Even the PKO law that to send people abroad to Cambodia was a big deal.
Yeah.
Now Japan is doing much more than just send people abroad in Ukraine as well as in joint activities, and as well as exporting arms.
Yeah, so those were some of the important reforms, if you want to use that word, of the pre-existing situation to 2015, because there were a bunch of ad hoc laws that had to be passed every time there was an activity overseas or extended. So there were a number of sort of extensions to, I think it was a mine sweeping operation in the Persian Gulf, those sorts of things. But now a number of those activities can occur without special legislation. So that's one of the changes. And I think, as you pointed out, that there's been a lot of loosening of the probable prohibition on exporting military things overseas, although my understanding is that there isn't a great market for Japanese military technology at the moment.
Okay, great. So then actually, I'll continue later. Really, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, everyone. My name is Akina Mikami. I'm probably one of the oldest students here. I've begun my PhD back in end of 2016. I've done my PhD part-time while raising young children here in Australia, and I'm very happy to inform you that you can complete your thesis. I can say that in retrospect now. My presentation today is called Critical Ocean Studies of Civil Society Practice, How Sea of Fukushima, Great Barrier Reef, and Billabongs of Ranger Mine Shape Fukushima Cairns Recuperation Practice. Just in the opening, I just wanted to acknowledge the Wotjabalak Jadwa, Jadwajali, Jubabakno, and Wagaya peoples, the traditional custodians of the lands on where I live, and the Miran people, the traditional custodians of the lands that became implicated in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident back in 2011. And I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also pay my respect to those affected by the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, tsunami and the subsequent nuclear accident, and honour those who continue to rebuild their lives today. So, in this presentation, So in this presentation, I'd like to examine civil society practice from a perspective of oceans and seas and rivers, the living bodies of water. I begin by briefly noting my research positionality and introduce the idea of critical ocean studies of civil society practice, and then I apply that approach to study a particular civil society-driven practice called recuperation practice that emerged following the 2011 Fukushima nuclear accident. And drawing on an example of a particular recuperation activity that's been happening here in Australia, I explore how the Sea of Fukushima, Billabongs of the Ranger Mine in the Kakadu, the Coral Sea and the Great Barrier Reef shape this civil society practice. I suggest that these engagements with these bodies of water in turn lead to a performative reclaiming of water as living home of children and future generations before concluding this presentation. So just a brief, it's important to note my research and positionality as I adopt an action research paradigm. My background is in the interdisciplinary field of media and communication studies that build on disciplines of anthropology, sociology, human geography and philosophy of science. I'm rooted in critical paradigm, that is to say that I view knowledge construction from the lens of uneven power relations, marginalisation and exclusion, but also critical hope and new possibilities emerging from the limits. I've conducted my PhD part-time while raising young children here in Australia. That was my first year of fieldwork with my second child, who's now already at school. And as I've mentioned earlier, I adopt action research. That's a particular way of approaching knowledge construction where you develop knowledge co-generatively with your research participants with the intent of contributing to positive social change. So in recent years in the social sciences, there has been a rise in critical ocean studies, blue humanities, and wet ontologies with its feminist, multi-species, and decolonial currents that seek to critically explore how the blue spaces shape social, political, and cultural life. Critical ocean studies scholar Elizabeth Delory argues that the scholarly turn to the ocean has given important emphasis on fluidity, flow, and mobility, and an ontological shift in the way we imagine the bodies of water in the Anthropocene. And today I'd like to apply that lens to think about civil societies. By civil society, I refer to a space that's distinct from the state and the market, where voluntary associations can be formed, grassroots voices can be heard, and alternative futures can be explored. And while there are growing debates of civil society practice being driven by specific issues such as human rights or identity politics, I'd like to contribute to these debates by offering a different perspective of critical ocean studies that decenter civil society studies from more anthropocentric, land-centric inquiry to think about how the oceans and the lands and the human societies interact and shape the civil society practice. Citing Elizabeth Mambogi's critical ocean studies scholar Elizabeth Dulaurie proposes that the ocean is a medium different from the earth. It forces us to think differently. The medium itself, where everything flows and everything is interconnected, forces us to unfocus, to shed our old concepts and paradigms, to refocus on a new paradigm. So the research that I've done for part of my PhD research has been to look at a particular civil society-driven practice called Recuperation practice that emerged immediately following the nuclear accident in 2011 in Fukushima, Japan. And in my involvement with this particular recuperation activity that was held in Cairns in Australia, time and time again I've heard from many participants who kept saying, someday I want to swim in the sea of Fukushima too. And that really sort of tugged on my heart, and it really made me think about what does that actually mean, when we think about the decades of impacts and the generational impacts of nuclear accident. And it was really fascinating for me to see the way that this civil society group would hold these children's sort of voices of concerns and hopes in generative tension, and to trace those, to hold on to these hopes of voices of hope, but then also to trace the wider entanglements that also shape this ongoing need. And so I just wanted to sort of start with this word, someday I want to swim the sea of Fukushima too, and then to look at how different bodies of water might shape this civil society practice. So just a little bit about this civil society group in Cairns. This civil society group based in Cairns creates opportunities for Fukushima children and Cairns community to connect, learn and explore what can be done to create a future where children can flourish following the Fukushima nuclear accident. This group, which I will call SWK, is led by a small group of Japanese women residing in Cairns and is supported by the local community, including the Japanese migrant community, local businesses, schools, sports clubs and social groups. This group was established in 2014, and this volunteer-run initiative began by organising what's called refresh camps, creating opportunities for children who immediately after the nuclear accident were not able to sort of play freely outdoors due to disaster-induced radiation concerns, to create a space where they can come to Cairns and spend time in the tropical rainforest, the Great Barrier Reef, and just to communicate, to spend time connecting with the families and communities in Cairns. And these camps were targeted towards junior high school students. And this kind of activity reflected a wider civil society-driven movement called Recuperation practice, or Hoyo Katsudo. And this actually was inspired by state-run recuperation activities in Belarus and Ukraine after the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear accident. Japanese civil society groups noticed the absence of such activities in Japan and began trialling it. Back in 2016, it was reported that more than 10,000 people participated yearly in these activities, organised by more than 200 groups. However, year after year, it's kind of declining, partly, in my view, because of the state-led reconstruction policy that kept amplifying the message of the safety of radiation issues, and so the recuperation activities sort of did not end up getting the adequate institutional support to sustain these activities. So unfortunately, year after year at the moment, it's declining in number. However, there continues to be need and demands for these activities. It's also noteworthy that this activity was held outside Japan too, in approximately 20 countries, including Australia. And it's really interesting that the ones in Cairns is still continuing today, even after the COVID pandemic. They're now thinking about running the camp again in the near future. And this camp that they organise once annually invites about 6 to 8 students from Fukushima, junior high school students from Fukushima, to come and spend about 7 to 12 days in Cairns. And during their time there, they would experience homestays, local school visits, overnight farm stays, and trips to the Great Barrier Reef's Franklin Islands, Kuranda Rainforest, and Paramela Park. And more than a place of refreshment, these camps also incorporate activities intended to broaden the perspectives of Fukushima students and the Cairns community. And these included speeches by Fukushima students, English speeches that are made by Fukushima students to communicate their experiences of the disaster to the Cairns community, their everyday lives in Fukushima, what's currently happening there, and their dreams and hopes for the future. And there were also sessions that facilitated learning and reflection about the Japan-Australia uranium link and the history of war between Japan and Australia. Although the council postponed from 2020 onwards due to the COVID-19 pandemic, SWK kept in touch with Fukushima students by holding monthly online meetings, and these discussions led to collaborative projects to make a video in 2021 and 2022, which brought together messages from students in Fukushima and Cairns about their reflections on the last decade and their hopes for the future. I would now like to pay attention to 3 bodies of water that are implicated in shaping this practice: the Sea of Fukushima, the Billabongs of Kakadu, and the coral on the Great Barrier Reef. One of the key activities of this civil society group is to provide a safe space for discussions and to consider the unbounded and connected aspects of the environment. And in April 2021, the Japanese government formally announced their intention of giving TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, the permission to discharge into the ocean treated radioactive water for across the period of 40 years, starting from early next year. And this decision was criticised by the local community in Fukushima, neighbouring countries such as China and South Korea, as well as Pacific Islands, where the impacts of nuclear testing from 1946 to 1996 continue to affect the islands and the people. And when that announcement happened, there was also an opportunity to talk with the Fukushima students about what they feel about it. And in the Zoom online meeting, there were some exchanges that were discussed. And most of the commentaries were more about the interconnectedness of the oceans. And one of the comments was the sea, the fish in the sea, the fishing industry, the people who consume the fish, the other countries sharing the same ocean. It's all connected. It's important to consider that. And another sort of space of discussions that's been had with Fukushima students have been learning about the experiences of Australian Indigenous peoples, especially the Mirarr people and their response to the Fukushima nuclear accident. The Mirarr people's lands are located in the Kakadu region, which includes the Ranger uranium mine that is currently undergoing rehabilitation after its closure in 2021. A month after the Fukushima nuclear power plant exploded, Yvonne Magarala, a senior traditional owner of the Mirarr people, wrote a letter on behalf of her people to the UN Secretary General, expressing her sorrow for the people of Fukushima and her grief that the uranium derived from their traditional lands may have contributed to the radiation problems in Fukushima. And it was later confirmed by the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office that the uranium mined from Ranger Mine and Olympic Dam in South Australia was present into the reactors that exploded. And so, during the pandemic, there was an opportunity for the Fukushima students to watch a video of Imamura's messages and to discuss about how they felt listening to her message. The video that they watched was actually filmed in 2010, before the nuclear accident, and just talks of the struggles that the Mirarr people face in their in their fight to stop the uranium mining or uranium being mined from their traditional lands. And in that they learn about the struggles they've been having since the 1970s in protecting their lands, and the sense of responsibility that the Mirarr people continue to feel towards what had happened in Fukushima. And learning about this Japan-Australia-Iranian connection raises awareness that the experiences of displacement and alteration of homelands are not limited to the people of Fukushima, but also are shared by communities across national borders, including Australian Indigenous peoples. And students have commented that I realised that Fukushima and Australia have something in common. And in this particular video that they watched, there's a scene of children swimming in the rivers, the Billabongs and the Kakadu, and Imamura notes that this year we learned that high levels of pollution from Ranger went into Kakadu. And so the radiation pollution is also experienced by the Australian Indigenous peoples, but of course it doesn't end there. The message is a one-off message of hope about how they're also trying to create education facilities and opportunities for children to learn what has happened and to build a better future for them, and sort of a narrative around how it's just a hope for the future, that this is not the end, that there's a resistance to being labelled as victims, but to be change makers, to be storytellers that can create alternative futures. And so there's a sort of I've noticed this common theme around this wish to sort of have children swimming in the river and the lifestyles and every experience that they have, and then just to move forward to a better future. And so there's a connection that's built there. I think I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to skip the video, but this is just a 4-minute video, so if you are interested, it's available on YouTube. There. Another opportunity that the Fukushima children have in the civil society groups activities is to raise awareness around the issues or the historical sort of understandings of the sea and the ocean. And this was really fascinating for me because at this point I realised that the narrative around the oceans is not so much this contaminated versus non-contaminated place, but rather there's sort of a shared grief around what the environment and the bodies of water is going through, but at the same time asking what can be done, what other futures can be possible. And part of that, there's a volunteer who every year talks to the children about history of war between Japan and Australia that's not really widely known, and there are some children who realise that this has happened for the first time by participating in this activity. And one of their... Okay, no worries. And one of the things that they learn is about the Battle of the Coral Sea that happened in 1942. And also they discuss about the issues that the Great Barrier Reef faces in terms of plastic waste, the pollutions, the coral bleaching. And so there are discussions around what can we do to make that, what are the things that could be done to raise awareness about protecting the oceans and the environment. So I guess the key argument or the key suggestion that I'd like to make is that these, on the one hand, there are the problems that are being faced with these different bodies of water, but at the same time, the engagements with the Fukushima students reclaim the spatial imagination of these living bodies of water as interconnected living home of children and future generations. To conclude, today I tried to look at civil society practice through the lens of critical ocean studies and to think about how bodies of water shape civil society practice. And I think as not just about radiation problems, but environmental problems in general, I feel like this approach could be useful to examine some of the civil society practice related to environmental problems we face today. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
So we've got about 8 or 9 minutes for Q&A, for questions from others. And feel free to take questions from the people there. And also happy, anybody who's joining online, feel free to put something in the chat if you want. And you can stop sharing if you would, Akina, so the screen opens back up for us.
Hi, Mikami-san. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Super interesting, and yeah, something that I think really reflects the just interconnectedness of humanity and the environment and the realities of climate change and environmental degradation. I was actually wondering about the action research process. It's probably a question that warrants quite a long answer, but I was wondering if you could maybe tell me a little bit about how you use the action research process and strategy in your research.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, there's a short and long answer to that, but I have recently completed a journal article with all the other action research students that's coming out very soon. So I'll forward you that article, and that just gives a real snapshot of my journey of action research. But I think the idea actually is, for me, what worked for me is just to find one group of people that I'd like to work with, build relationships with them, learn how to inquire, because I've learned that there's so many different ways that people produce knowledge and talk about knowledge. And after learning how to co-inquire, to then, to co-generate that into your dissertation, which is another process altogether. So I think there are a few stages, but I think I would say that it's very exciting. I think it's much more exciting than conventional research. There are expect the unexpected, because you're dealing with real life experiences and real people, and it can get messy, but you'll also learn skills and knowledge of how to deal with things as it comes along. So sorry, it's just a very broad way of saying it, but I will pass you the journal article. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking out until this last presentation, and I apologize for the delay earlier. So I'm David. I'm doing a PhD here at the University of Melbourne at the Asia Institute. My supervisors are Professor Andrew Roser of the Asia Institute and Professor John Langmore of the University's Peace Building Initiative. So today I'm presenting a paper on mobilizing for press freedom in the Philippines, its nature and challenges. Okay, so this paper will be published at the Melbourne Asia Review's latest issue after I finish my field work in the Philippines, because my current ethics application doesn't allow me to publish anything while my field work is ongoing. This paper is one of the topics of my PhD dissertation. My research examines human rights mobilizations during the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte from 2016 to 2022. I'm looking at 4 key issues: press freedom, the death penalty, lowering the minimum age for criminal responsibility, and the extrajudicial killings related to the war on drugs. So this specific paper is based on qualitative data gathering I've done with journalists, news organizations, and civil society organizations, mostly in Metro Manila in the Philippines, but also in the cities of Bacolod and Iloilo in the Visayas. So, this paper aims to answer two key questions. Number one, what is the nature of mobilizations for press freedom during the Duterte presidency? And second, what were the impacts of press freedom mobilizations on the Duterte government's attacks against the media? These questions aim to understand how mobilizations for press freedom were carried out during the presidency of Duterte, as well as the relationships and dynamics between various mobilizing actors. This is some question for my dissertation's bigger research question on what conditions lead to successful human rights mobilizations in the Philippines under a condition like the Duterte presidency. The theoretical approach I'm using to answer these questions is the social conflict approach, or the Murdoch school. In using this approach, I want to understand the conflicts, tensions, and convergences between mobilizing actors, as well as how social and political conflicts between these actors are impacted by the nature of capitalism in the Philippines, which has often been classified as an oligarchic democracy or an elite democracy. In combining with this social conflict approach is elements of the contested democracy framework by Filipino scholar Nathan Kimpo. This framework not only considers the actions of elites but also actors from below, that is democracy from below. Hence, I'm more focused on the mobilizing actors rather than what can be considered in Philippine society as traditional elites. So based on the data that I've gathered from my interview so far, the key argument being presented in this essay is that actors that mobilize for press freedom in the Philippines lack overall solidarity, which lessens the impact of mobilizations for press freedom. This lack of solidarity is impacted by various challenges, and for the sake of brevity, I'll only discuss four in this presentation. There is much more. First is the political economy of media ownership in the Philippines, competition in the business side of news, corruption in the Philippine media, and issues with funding. So most interviewees I talked to here chose to remain anonymous because some of them have non-disclosure agreements with their former companies. Others have pending legal cases and are still facing harassment on multiple fronts. So I thank them for their bravery to speak out. So first, before I'm looking at two case studies for this research. And I'd like to give an overview of the abuses against press freedom during the Duterte presidency. So the two case studies involve Rappler and ABS-CBN. For full disclosure, I used to be a multimedia journalist for Rappler from 2013 to 2017, just going into the Duterte, in the first year of the Duterte presidency. So it must be noted that these two organizations are not the only ones that experience harassment from government during the Duterte regime. News organizations I talked to from the provinces also experience harassment in the form of police visitations and online harassment. These two companies were selected mostly when they were facing various charges from the government, taking the biggest mobilizations in Metro Manila and in the provinces. So both news organizations experienced their share of online harassment. However, this will not be the focus of abuses when I talk about what abuses were done to them. For Rappler, I focus on what Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa calls the weaponization of the law. Rappler is one of the biggest news online organizations in the Philippines, and it drew the ire of the Duterte government for its investigative reporting on the war on drugs and the weaponization of the internet. In January 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission revoked Rappler's corporate license to operate for allegedly violating the Philippine Constitution and the anti-dumping law, which relates to evading foreign equity restrictions. The news organization was accused of an illegal level of foreign ownership due to Philippine depository receipts from a Omidyar network. The Philippine Constitution prohibits any level of ownership by non-Filipino citizens or corporations in media, although PDRs are a common investment tool used by Philippine companies to access foreign capital. By February 2018, Omidyar had donated its PDRs to Rappler managers. However, the SEC, even after the mandated review by the Court of Appeals, upheld its decision to shut down Rappler. Rappler has taken the case to the Supreme Court with the decision still currently pending. Other legal attacks against Rapper focus on alleged tax evasion and libel cases against one of its founders, Maria Ressa. Maria is currently on trial for alleged tax evasion and was convicted of criminal cyber libel in 2020, a decision which was upheld on appeal in July. The other case study is ABS-CBN. Duterte's anger towards it stemmed from the fact that its Davao Regional Network, not the national network, did not air one of his paid advertisements during the 2016 presidential elections. The network could not air some of the local ads due to scheduling issues and refunded 4 million pesos paid to it by the Duterte campaign. Duterte was also allegedly angered by the airing of an advertisement of a critic targeting him during the run-up to the 2016 polls. The network has since apologized for both incidents. By law, Philippine corporations have to apply for a broadcasting franchise license from Congress before being allowed to operate. ABS-CBN's congressional franchise was due to expire on May 4, 2020. Prior to this, Duterte had repeatedly threatened the company that its franchise would not be renewed. In February 2020, the Solicitor General filed a co-warranty petition to revoke the media giant's franchise. While the Supreme Court did not act on this petition, ABS-CBN faced an uphill battle on the House Committee on Legislative Franchises. ABS-CBN had to apply for a congressional franchise to continue its operations beyond May 4, 2020. The committee, of course, was controlled by Duterte, given his supermajority in the House of Representatives. As the franchise expired and the free television went off air on May 5, 2020, the House Committee continued its deliberations. It was during one of these deliberations that lawmakers grilled the media giant's news division, and then on July 10, 2020, the House Committee voted to deny the franchise renewal of ABS-CBN. Only 11 lawmakers voted against the resolution, while 70 voted to shut down the company. The franchise did not even reach the floor of the House of Representatives. It died on committee. Both attacks against news organizations utilized legal arguments and legal mechanisms. So this is an effective tactic because, according to one Rapper executive, it makes it difficult for the public to understand. So when you use the law, when you use technical cases to attack press freedom, the details get muddled and the public doesn't necessarily understand. It is obvious, however, that the same playbook that Duterte played, or the Duterte government played in Rapper, was later used for ABS-CBN. So given these cases, what was the nature of mobilizations for press freedom during the time of Duterte? Looking at the data, I'm currently able to classify two types of mobilizations. The first one is a more traditional way of protests. As you may well know, the Philippines has a very rich tradition of protesting on the streets. Some press freedom mobilizations took the form of traditional protests. For example, when the SEC ordered the shutdown of Rappler in 2019, the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines conducted the first Black Friday protest. So these Black Friday protests then became a weekly event, starting from January 2020 when ABS-CBN was declared shut down. The Black Friday protests for ABS-CBN were only disrupted because of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. If you can imagine, ABS-CBN, the biggest and most wide-reaching television network in the Philippines, was shut down by the government at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, when information was badly needed across the Philippine archipelago. In protests for supporting both organizations, the NUJP was crucial in mobilizing on-ground support. For ABS-CBN, in the first few Black Friday protests, and this is a revelation from some people from ABS-CBN, the management itself did not actively support the protests. So NUJP was protesting in behalf of a company who didn't want to defend itself. In a sense, NUJP mobilized on behalf of ABS-CBN, which became a source of frustration for many of the journalists. Of course, the different factions of the Philippine left, including the Makabayan Bloc, or the National Democratic Left, and the moderate left, Akbayan, also provided much-needed on-ground support. The Makabayan Bloc is an alliance of organizations and party lists centered around national democratic principles, while the Akbayan ascribes more to socialist democratic principles. Both factions, however, are a minority in Congress. A former Rapper manager who chose to remain anonymous said of these alliances with the left that it is based on goodwill, on trust and respect. So the basic principle is independence and initiative. They enter into an alliance because of mutual respect for each other's values not necessarily because of quid pro quo arrangements. A second and a more indirect form of mobilization is that news organizations who are unable or who are afraid of mobilizing traditionally on the ground took a more indirect form by running campaigns on disinformation. These campaigns took the form of education seminars for key sectors, online fact-checking efforts, and forums on disinformation. Since the 2015 presidential campaign, disinformation has significantly increased in the Philippines. Rappler has done extensive investigative reporting on how online trolls weaponized social media to spread the Duterte government's propaganda. A 2022 report shows how Duterte institutionalized disinformation at the state level. Thus, disinformation is linked to government propaganda, and fighting online disinformation is seen by interviewees as a way to mobilize for press freedom. So one of the leading coalitions against disinformation was the Initiative for Press Freedom. It's a 5-year program implemented by Interviews Philippines, funded by USAID. So this coalition has produced important studies on the impact of disinformation in the Philippines, on the Philippine media landscape, and on fighting disinformation during the elections. Other organizations that have made lots of efforts against disinformation are Verifiles and the Philippine Press Institute, which is the National Association of Newspapers with close to 70 members across the archipelago. So 2 other alliances against disinformation were created for the 2022 presidential elections. Fact Check PH, led mostly by academics from the University of the Philippines, and Facts First PH, led by Rappler with funding from the Google News Initiative. So I'll go back to these other two alliances later. So given these forms of mobilizations, these are the challenges faced by actors in the press freedom space to forming a more united front against government abuses. So I argue that these fractures and internal issues within Philippine media negatively affect the overall solidarity among mobilizing organizations, and thus in turn impact the effectiveness of mobilizations. In other words, media cannot come together even for an existential crisis. So first is the political economy of media ownership in the Philippines, which prevents news organizations from supporting each other when they are under siege. This quote from Melinda de Jesus of the Center for Media and Freedom and Responsibility in the Philippines best sums it up. So, because owners of the news organizations have interests in other sectors, those become like the media becomes hostage to other businesses. So one family who owns a media organization would be afraid to speak out against the government or support another news organization because they're afraid that their investments in clean energy, in power, in transportation might be held hostage by the government through various regulations. So multiple interviewees noted that many of their journalist colleagues were being censored by their own news organizations during the Duterte administration. Some even reported self-censorship by their management. This is out of fear of being targeted next by the Duterte government. Senior journalists from ABS-CBN noted that at the height of the shutdown, individual journalists from other news networks would offer support personally, but very few news organizations issued institutional statements of support. Some journalists were prevented by their media executives from showing up at the protests and being vocal on social media. Surprisingly, insiders claim that even the ABS-CBN management initially did not fully support the mobilizations for its franchise renewal. Employees were also unsure whether they were allowed to join the protests. One insider claimed it wasn't really sanctioned by the management. If they supported it, they didn't actually show because they were of the view that they also had to protect the business. So they cannot go all out against the administration because they also had other business interests. So the protest actions were really initiated by the NUJP, end quote. Eventually, sources claimed there was a shift in the management's attitude towards the protests, with logistical support being provided, and some celebrities such as actors being allowed to speak out. This is when it was obvious that ABS-CBN needed more public support to pressure Congress into giving it a franchise. If you look at the congressional hearings during the franchise renewal issue, it's very obvious that because ABS-CBN is a big media corporation and news is only one of its divisions, the executives of the bigger corporation, journalists would claim, threw the news division under the bus, take the fall and like take all the hate from the congressmen, while they wanted to preserve the other parts, the other segments of the media business. Second is the competitive nature of journalism in the Philippines. So the Philippine media market is small, although we have a population of 110 million, with many media groups fighting for advertising revenue. So prior to its shutdown, ABS-CBN led the broadcast market, with GMA7 coming in second and TV5 at a far third. So this quote from a senior journalist from ABS-CBN best sums it up. If ABS-CBN shut down, it's good for business for the competitors. Even those interviewed in the regional networks expressed the same sentiment. Some journalists did not support ABS-CBN and Rappler because they thought it would be good for their revenues if their competitors are taken down. When Duterte started attacking the media early in his administration, there was a meeting between heads of major news organizations to discuss how to potentially fight back. This eventually led to the creation of the Freedom for Media, Freedom for All Coalition, which aimed to protect press freedom and present a united front in fighting against government attacks. However, as the attacks on press freedom escalated, only a few organizations became actively involved. De Jesus from the CMFR noted that the members of FMFA steering committee were primarily the non-profit organizations, not the news organizations who were creating content. Another incident shows how the political economy of media ownership affects this challenge. Multiple sources claim that there was an effort to get the owners of big three broadcast networks, ABS-CBN, GMA, and TV5, to meet at the height of, just before the ABS-CBN shutdown issue, to meet to discuss how they could potentially support each other. However, this did not push through because some of the news owners declined the invitation. So they didn't even want to talk with other owners of the big networks. Third, it's an open secret that some journalists receive bribes from politicians. These journalists are then used to spread the government's propaganda and criticize other news organizations. So this corruption among the media is linked to low wages and the economic disparity between Manila-based media and those in the provinces. For example, a new journalist, fresh from University Journalist in Metro Manila, would get around 470 AUD monthly, whereas a new journalist in the provinces would get $260 monthly. And then these people then become, because of the corruption that's embedded within the system, especially in the provinces, these journalists are being used against other journalists to carry on the government propaganda and attack others. That's why, also like a personal story, like even when we were covering disasters before, local political families and clans or warlords are so used to journalists asking for money that even when the national media comes covering disasters, imagine thousands of your constituents dying, these politicians would still prepare bundles of money to give out to journalists, and they expected us to take it. So that just shows how embedded media corruption is for the local politicians. Fourth, funding for press freedom activities is scarce and becomes a source of competition. CMFR, the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, for example, has no permanent funding and has to actively look for funders on a yearly basis. Most funding on press freedom in the Philippines is currently centered around fighting misinformation, as shown in the two fact-checking coalitions that were created for the 2022 presidential elections. Fact Check Philippines, led mostly by academics from the University of the Philippines, and Facts First PH, led by Rappler, funded by the Google News Initiative. However, these two coalitions have separate agendas and activities. So, because of the personal issues between journalists and senior executives, they cannot even come up with one singular coalition to fight against misinformation. So it becomes a hindrance for them to come together. Some of my news sources would say, if this organization or if this person is participating in an activity we will not actively participate. So that's the level of personal issues within and baggage between senior journalists. But even for press freedom initiatives that have funding, the nature of the funding institutions can sometimes impose limitations. In one of the coalitions that received foreign funding, a member noted that they were not allowed as a coalition to issue statements in support of ABS-CBN. They were encouraged as individual organizations to do so, but not as a united coalition. So the worry is that releasing a statement as a coalition would impact the Philippine government's relationship with the foreign funding institution. So the foreign funding institution did not want the coalition they led to issue statements because they were afraid that the Duterte government would cut ties with them. So given these four issues, what's the hope for Philippine media? Can they get their act together to face existential issues like disinformation and legal attacks by the government? One of the key things that people always talk about, that most sources will talk about, is the chilling effect. So this is perhaps the biggest factor that curtailed the impact of press freedom mobilizations. Filipinos supported Duterte, and this translated to a Marcos presidency despite the previous government's abuses. The chilling effect is a common populist tool used to stifle dissent. For Philippine media, the chilling effect were not just caused by online illegal attacks against journalists and news organizations. Remember that while this was all happening on the media front, extrajudicial killings related to the war on drugs and red tagging were happening. The government was trying to lower the minimum age of criminal responsibility from 15 years old to 9 years old, and they were trying to restore the death penalty in Congress. And of course, at the latter part, the pandemic crippled the global economy. So the media, the Philippine media, alongside other Philippine institutions, were overwhelmed. There's also an admission on the side of the media of their failure to educate the public on the importance of press freedom. And as you know, as one of the key sources say, the public is supposed to defend the media, but instead the public turned against the media. So lastly, so there's hope for future press freedom mobilizations though. The National Union of Journalists in the Philippines believes that there are pockets of solidarity among individual journalists, even if it does not come to extend to their institutions. We have seen cases where media came together for an existential issue. The Maguindanao massacre in 2009, when 34 journalists were killed by a warlord in the south, saw media groups united in demanding accountability. Sources in NUJP believe such institutional media solidarity is still possible. Second, there's a lot of funding available for disinformation campaigns, and news organizations are slowly adapting. However, with the recent results of the Philippine elections, it seems that disinformation campaigns are not adapting fast enough. Sources claim that processes for fact-checking activities are quite bureaucratic compared to the disinformation networks that are very agile. Lastly, there's also more international attention now being given to press freedom issues in the Philippines, partly thanks to Maria winning the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Duterte's election in 2016 was the testing site for the eventual disinformation networks that plagued the 2016 US presidential elections. Advocates hope that more international attention will eventually lead to more institutionalized and consistent support for press freedom in the Philippines. A lot of my sources say that more introspection is needed by the Philippine media. It needs to take a look at itself and ask whether it can get its act together to counter existential issues like government attacks and disinformation. Whatever introspection is needed, media organizations and civil society groups in the press freedom space need to organize fast. Because if you look at the 2022 Philippine presidential elections, most of the Filipino public are still not on the side of the media, they're not on the side of truth, and online disinformation in the Philippines continues to elect presidents. So thank you. These are the organizations that I talked to.